I can see the first one, which says, could I please show the first list of sources again? That was immediately before the book, so I put that on the screen. I hope you can see that. Is my screen sharing again?
It is, yep.
It is, okay. I'll leave that there for a little while then. The next one says Hong Kong. I assume that's part of the NHS, which we've just done. And the second question is, will a copy of the talk be available afterwards? That's one for you, I think, Louis.
Well, if you're able to,
what I can do, I can send the slides to you.
Yep. Okay. And then anybody who would like a copy of the slides, then let me know, and I will email them to you. So that'd be fine. So if you would like a copy of the slides, maybe the easiest thing to do is to say you'd like them in the chat and give your email address. Make it really easy for me, and I will do that.
The next one's a comment, which is perhaps a reason that people are reluctant to have their details shared in the national database is the database could be hacked. Could such a risk be completely removed so people would consent? Now, of course, no, it can't be completely removed. And I think that is one of the worries now. The problem is, of course, that if ever we wanted a basic income to be paid, there would need to be such a database. So that's going to be a complex political and psychological argument for people to have. The next question is about not everyone is a citizen. A basic income could mean that a foreign national and the UK national doing the same job got a very different income. When there's a complex question relating to basic income, we've always set up a working group of experts to study it and come up with some kind of resolution. And we did this with precisely this question, rather the broader question, who should get the basic income? Now, of course, this is not a new question in the benefit system, because precisely that question has to be asked in relation to any benefit system. And where the working group began was with this country's existing regulations for child benefit, because those regulations already grant child benefit to any legal resident. Now, the whole question of citizenship in this country is so complex that the working group decided not to rely in any sense on the word citizenship. Most of us are not citizens at all. We are subjects of a monarch as far as the constitution of this country is concerned. And the only people who are properly citizens are those who've been through a citizenship ceremony at the town hall. It's a bizarre position we're in this country. So the question comes down to one of legal residence, that is, who is legally here? And of course, that's a much broader group than many people realize, because a lot of asylum seekers, refugees are legally here. And so legal residence is clearly the right category for who should receive basic income. The question is that when people should receive it is a political question. That is, would a government feel obliged to say you have to have been here for a certain number of years before you get it? An interesting parallel case is the Alaska dividend. The Alaska dividend is an annual dividend paid out of the fund built up from oil revenues in Alaska. And every citizen of Alaska, and of course they do have a robust citizenship definition in American states, every citizen of Alaska receives the dividend, provided they've been there for a year and they are clearly intending to stay. And a similar provision will probably be required for receiving a basic income here. Probably something like every legal resident who's been here for, say, 2 or 3 years and lives here for most of the year, something of that nature. If you look at our website, there's an introductory booklet there on the front page, which you can download and use, and there's a paragraph about who should receive basic income in that booklet. The next question was what was the effective marginal tax rate in the example of UBI that Malcolm gave? With the examples I've seen, a UBI lower than JSA is that they have required tax change that effectively increase the ETMR, that's the marginal rate. The answer to that question is the ways in which marginal rates change is incredibly complicated. One of my working papers does do some work on that. It's one published about, I think about 2 years ago, perhaps 3 years now. The reason it's complicated is that your household structure affects it, because it affects, because if you're on, say, working tax credits or universal credit, and you then go on to a basic income, then there's quite a complicated way in which the two individuals find their the combination of their different tax and benefit situations changing can be quite complicated. And all you can conclude is average figures for different groups of people. You can say that in general, in this country, if you're on universal credit, then you end up with something like 24p in the pound of any extra pound that you earn. If you're on the legacy benefits, then you can end up with a lot less than that. And one of the advantages of universal credit, I know there are lots of disadvantages, is that it's got a marginal rate below that of the legacy benefits. What we do know is that anybody on means tested benefits currently would be on a lower deduction rate if they came off those benefits. There is, however, a complexity in relation to the size of the tax allowance. Many basic income schemes, including most of those that I have researched, assume that the income tax personal allowance will be reduced in order to help pay for the basic income. And of course, that will increase the marginal deduction rate for some households. If previously you were earning and you were earning an income and you were below the income tax personal allowance threshold, then you would not be paying income tax. If that threshold came down in order to help to pay for basic income, then you would find yourself on a new deduction rate, which would be the basic rate of tax. So there would be households that would find themselves having their marginal rates increased by 30-something% from 0. There would also be individuals who would find their, if they were, say, a part-time earner in a household with 2 earners, then an individual might find themselves with a higher deduction rate because they'd find themselves paying tax for the first time. But at the same time, they would be receiving their basic income. So their marginal rate might go up, but they would be better off, or there would be no difference in their disposable incomes. It is a very complex picture, unfortunately. And that is the reason for that is the complex taxes and benefit structure we have in this country. The reason for the complexity is not the basic income, but because the basic income would have to relate to the current tax and benefit system, the entire system becomes complicated. And I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. So in answer to the question, there isn't a single marginal rate in relation to a basic income. Each household would experience something different. How would the UBI contribute to the viability of a Green New Deal? There is sections on this in the book, Why We Need a Systems Basic Income. This has become a much more important aspect of the argument recently as to how a basic income would affect the debate over climate change and the necessity for a more sustainable economy. And it's something which some of us have put some work into. And if it's something you're really interested in, then there's an entire chapter on this issue in that international handbook I showed you, written by 3 experts from different parts of the world. So if that really interests you, then see if you can get a library. I don't recommend you buy that handbook, it's far too expensive, but see if you can get a library to get hold of it for you. But the basic answer to the question is this, and it's in several parts. First of all, it is an unfortunate fact that if inequality was reduced, and this is by any means at all, this is not simply a discussion about basic income. If inequality were to go down, then carbon emissions would go up. This is a fact of life. The reason is that the propensity to consume is higher for low-income households. What that means is that if you were to give the same amount of additional income to a wealthy household and to a low-income household, then the low-income household would spend more of it into the economy than the high-income household, which would be more likely to save some of it. So the low-income household is more likely to spend into the national economy, which would increase production and therefore increase carbon emissions. That's simply the way it is. The other part of the story, of course, is this. An important mechanism for trying to ensure that our carbon emissions go down would be a carbon tax. It's an obvious thing to do, and we have now seen experiments in a number of countries, particularly recently in Canada, and Canada's had the more successful experience with this than France did when they tried to increase the duty on fuel. The mistake that France made was not to protect the incomes that would be affected by the price rises. This was a mistake that Canada did not make. Canada has granted not a basic income exactly, but household dividends on the basis of the new revenue from the carbon tax. What this does is it protects the incomes of poorer households, enabling them to pay the price rises imposed by the carbon tax. Any carbon tax would increase prices. That's the whole point. If you impose a tax on carbon, then fuel prices will rise, heating costs will rise unless the heating is powered by renewable energy. And the food we eat will become more expensive because transport costs will rise and so on. Prices go up. And the important thing is to protect incomes. And you could, of course, do that by using the revenue from the carbon tax to pay a basic income. And that argument is now made more and more often. And in my view, that's the most important connection between basic income and the necessity to reduce our carbon emissions. But as I say, if you're really interested in this question, which is a complex one with many parts to an answer, then have a look at the handbook. Where are we? Why do some suggest the support for basic income by some on the right suggests a problem? Well, I don't think it does. Is there anything in addition to current measures that closes some of the gaps and gets us closer to BI and uses perhaps council tax data? Now, there is perhaps slightly more to be said about the first part of that question, and it's this. I once was asked to debate with an American academic called Lawrence Mead, who has views similar to those of Charles Murray, if you've ever come across his work. Their support for a basic income is generated by their wish to get rid of the existing welfare state. So their argument is if you were to pay everybody an unconditional income, then you could abandon public services. You could abandon any public provision of healthcare, you could abandon other benefits and so on. That is a fairly extreme right-wing view of what a basic income could do. It is, of course, entirely erroneous. The logic is seriously flawed. And it's flawed for this reason. It's a reason which is not always obvious from the language that's used, because the same word can mean different things, and I'll explain why. A basic income is unconditional. Our National Health Service is unconditional. There are no conditions attached to using it. However, the two unconditionalities are utterly different, and it's important to recognise the distinction. A basic income would be an unconditionality of supply. That is, everybody would get exactly the same, if they were the same age, every week or every month. It's an unconditionality of supply. The National Health Service is utterly different from that. It's an unconditionality of access when you need it. And so, for instance, one member of the population might absorb £500,000 worth of healthcare costs in their lifetime, and another might absorb almost none at all. We have different health needs, and the whole point of the National Health Service is that it meets those needs when they arise. What you can't do is replace a National Health Service which relies on unconditionality of access when the need arises with an unconditional income, simply because it would not cover the costs of those who need a lot of healthcare expenditure. So the logic is erroneous. Lawrence Mead wasn't listening, unfortunately, and he went away still convinced that you could replace public services with an unconditional income. Of course you can't. And nobody should ever argue for a basic income on the basis that it would enable us to abandon public services. We need them both. They're not in conflict. And although there has been an attempt by some who support public services to say that a basic income would damage public services and the existing welfare state, there is of course no reason why it should. As I've explained, it's perfectly feasible to implement a basic income that would not cost additional public expenditure. And if that kind of scheme were to be implemented, then there will be no impact whatsoever on public services. If a very expensive basic income were to be implemented that needed funds from elsewhere, then of course it would risk the funding of public services, and a debate would need to be had. But one of the good reasons for researching revenue neutral basic income schemes is that that issue never arises. Is there anything in addition to current measures that closes some of the gaps and gets us closer to basic income and uses perhaps council tax data? Yes, of course there could be. And one of the interesting changes we've seen the government make is to have removed some of the conditionalities from universal credit. Now, whether those will stay removed, I have no idea, and I don't think anybody else has either, perhaps not the government. But if you were to carry on removing conditionalities, then of course eventually you'd get to a basic income. I don't suppose that's going to happen for 1 minute. But yes, there are things that you could do. We do, of course, already have a basic income for children in child benefit. It is still unconditional, whatever is often said about it. It has not been means tested. There is now a tax charge related to it. That's a different matter entirely. This country is now in the bizarre position of having an unconditional income for children and a tax on children. And I've no idea how the government got itself into that kind of twist. Next question, Mary Louise. We found in the Green Party for England and Wales is that without UBI, people on lower incomes would end up worse off in the Green New Deal because of increases in taxes. Yeah, I mean, I think I've answered that one. Yes, the two policies of carbon tax and basic income fit together extremely well. And in my view, they need each other. So there's a copy of slides, please. Good. Do you have an online video that explains what you've discussed today that can be shared to help cascade the points you have made? Yes, sort of is the answer to that. On the Citizens Basic Income Trust website, on the front page, you'll find a short video. And at the end of that video, there's a link to a longer video, should you want that. Interestingly, there's been quite a lot of new activity in this direction recently. And in fact, only yesterday, I finished a script for a new introductory video, which will come out soon on the Share Ideas YouTube channel, if you know that one. And so there is plenty of material out there now for you to look for. As I say, there is one on the front page of the Citizens Basic Income website, and you can see the website address on your screen now. That was made for us a little while ago. It's slightly out of date now, but it's still quite a good little video. Where there are a few real world examples you've been tried. The answer is there are not a few real world examples of basic income trials. There have been just 2 genuine basic income trials, one in Namibia and one in India. They were both highly successful pilot projects. They were for genuine basic incomes, that is unconditional incomes for every member of the communities. And the results were even better than we expected them to be. Economic activity rose, particularly amongst low-income households. Women's emancipation improved, so the educational outcomes, health outcomes improved. A vast number of different improvements were discovered for a relatively small basic income for those communities, and they were 2-year projects. What we've seen more recently in developed countries is 2 things. First of all, experiments that you can't really call basic income schemes. So for instance, in Finland, 2,000 unemployed individuals randomly selected from across the country had their unemployment benefits made unconditional for 2 years. Now that was a sort of a basic income according to the definition, but we weren't going to see any community-wide benefits of it. And because it was so short and everybody involved in it was still surrounded by people on means-tested benefits and would have had their minds on when the experiment was going to finish, mindsets are unlikely to have altered in any significant extent. Having said that, it was still a very useful experiment, and it had results which I thought were quite interesting, but which of course were spun in different directions, as they often are. What was discovered was that employment market activity stayed exactly the same. Now you can either say that, well, it didn't rise, did it? So the effect that you expect from having part of your income unconditional and therefore your marginal deduction rates reduced, that didn't appear. Or you could say, well, look, employment market activity didn't fall, did it? Because what we didn't see was fewer people entering employment because they had an unconditional income. My view is that the 2 effects probably balanced out, which would be an interesting conclusion to draw. But we've only had the first year's results so far. We're still awaiting for the second year's results and some more analysis. What we did see, and this part of the results was quite significant, was that the well-being of all those involved increased considerably. And of interest to the politicians, trust in politicians rose substantially amongst the experimental group. Now, whether that means we're going to see more experiments of this nature so that politicians feel more trusted is an interesting question. But there are some more places, particularly in this country, where they would like to hold pilot projects. The problem we've got is it's really difficult to hold a real pilot project in a developed country. The reason is that you have a choice. You either simply give people some extra money on top of what happens now, and you look to see what happens. But then, of course, you couldn't replicate that across the country because you couldn't afford it. Or you try and change the existing tax and benefit systems in those pilot communities, because then you could replicate what a real basic income scheme would look like. But HMRC and the DWP are not going to do that, and the government isn't going to ask them to do that. It would be a complicated matter to change tax and benefits regulations for a single community. And I'm not surprised that the previous chancellor said that it wasn't even going to be considered. It's not on the mind of the current one, I'm quite sure. So there is a problem in developed countries with existing tax and benefit system. The only answer is that sooner or later, a more developed country with a more developed economy is simply going to have to implement a basic income. If I was a betting person, then I'd say a small country is going to do it first. And when one country does it, others will follow, because the advantages would clearly be considerable. But I've never predicted who is going to be first. If I was going to predict, then I would predict that a single Indian state would do it first, because Indian states have substantial autonomy in this field. They don't have to wait for a national government to decide they can do it. And there have been some really interesting, genuine pilot projects in India. And so if I was a betting man, that's where my money would be. And it wouldn't be on here, I'm afraid.
So we've come to 1:30. So what I'm going to suggest is that maybe if Malcolm was agreeable, maybe we take perhaps 1 or 2 more questions and maybe have another 10 minutes, and then I think we'll have to call it a day, if that's okay with you, Malcolm.
Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll look through the questions, see if there's anything that's on the territory that we haven't touched at all, because some of them relate to, we haven't actually answered the questions, but we've been on the same territory already. Well, briefly, I'll address the question about sickness and disability benefits. Yes, they would have to stay completely outside basic income proposals. The whole point of a basic income is that it's unconditional. And once you start to, if you were to say, we'll add a bit more for people with disabilities, well, that's not a basic income anymore. And it will be important to continue to run other benefit systems. We simply can't do without them, because there's no way that an unconditional income is going to provide sufficient for the needs of those with more substantial needs who cannot earn an income. So yes, we're going to need completely separate systems. There's some questions about negative income tax, which I think I'll deal with. So 2 questions I'll deal with. One about negative income tax. Yes, it is of course true that we administer a tax system. And the question is, would administering a negative income tax be any more complicated than that, basically? I think I've got the gist of that right. Yes. No, the answer to that is that administering a negative income tax is actually very different from administering income tax. An employer who's administering your income tax will simply receive from the tax office a tax code for you. And that's based on your last year's tax return, if you do one, or it's simply related to the tables, the computerized tables now, which the employer has, which will tell the employer how much to deduct, so that by the end of the year, you have paid the right amount of tax in relation to the tax rates and the personal allowance. And the reason you get a P45 when you leave your job is so that that process can be rolled over easily to the next employer. And at the end of the year, if there's a rebate due, you will receive that automatically through the tax system. There is nothing difficult about the income tax system because nothing has to be paid out on a weekly or monthly basis to you. With a negative income tax, a payment has to be made to you once a week or once a month. Nothing can wait till the end of the year to sort out. It has to be paid to you weekly or monthly. And because the tax system is being run by your employer, it will be paid by your employer. And the employer will know, let's suppose that there is a negative income tax system, and you have just the one employment. And it's a permanent employment that goes on for years and years. Then there's no complexity. That's the ideal context for a negative income tax. Because then the employer knows your earned income. If you're below the threshold, then the employer knows precisely how much to pay to you extra in your pay packet once a week or once a month, however it is you're paid. That's easy. No problem with that at all. The problem arises if you have more than one job, for instance, then that employer who's paying your negative income tax either has to relate to the other employer and they have to agree to pay some of it each, or one employer has to know how much the other employer is paying you, and so on. There has to be communication. Whereas with the normal tax system, if you have two employments, then one employee will simply be allocated the basic tax, the BR tax code, the basic rate by the tax office. And anything that's not quite right will get sorted out at the end of the year. You can't do that with a negative income tax. You have to get it right every week or every month. Similarly, if you have a break in your employment, this is no problem at all to the income tax system. You might end up at the end of the year with a rebate to come, but that can be done at the end of the year, and it is. What you can't do is leave to the end of the year a negative income tax payment, because that's a payment that you need to live on. So there is actually a big difference between the administration of income tax and the administration of negative income tax. It is a complex field. There is a difference there. There are various suggestions here about how you might begin to put together a database for paying a basic income, and you'll see on our website that where it says our article on this page twice. The second one is based on a short piece of research on how you could actually put together a database that could be used for paying a basic income. So if you want to look at that article, then you'll see where we got to with that. It was a very quick piece of work. It's not flawless. The problem with it is that it would need considerable cooperation, not only between government departments, which is not always easy to organise, but between government departments and financial institutions, because government departments usually don't have a full list of records of people's bank account details, which of course is what you'd need to pay basic incomes. It is unfortunate that whilst the basic income is an incredibly simple idea, in fact it could not be simpler, implementing a basic income in the context of a developed country would be extremely complicated. Because it will be dead easy to do, much easier to do in a developing economy, that's where it's most likely to happen first. One really interesting aspect of the Indian pilot project was that communities, and there's 20-something communities were in the pilot, and from different contexts. There were urban communities, rural communities, and tribal communities were all in the experiment. It took only a few weeks for every member of all of those communities to end up with a bank account when they hadn't had them, because of the incentive to get a bank account for every individual, not just household bank accounts. Every individual had to have their own, And so it was a rapid improvement in financial inclusion. Was one of the results of the pilot project. And of course, the banks were interested because suddenly they were going to have people with bank accounts that for at least 2 years were going to have money flowing into them, not vast amounts, but money. And so with a developing economy, there will be huge advantages straight away to paying a basic income over and above the advantages that you would see in a country like ours. And that's, I think, one of the major reasons for expecting a place like India to get there first. But that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Right. Thanks very much, Malcolm. I think we've gone past our time and had a 10-minute extra time as in football, but I think we're going to have to call it a day there. I'm going to say thank you very much on behalf of everyone here, but I'm also going to unmute everybody and allow everybody to show their appreciation by perhaps a clap of hands and to thank you for your time so freely given. We've not paid you or paid your expenses, and you're giving your time again for us, and we really do appreciate it. So thank you very much. That's now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you for interesting questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Gary-Ann.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Louis.
Slides, then